today we're going to talk about writing scholarly abstracts. And when I say scholarly abstracts, I'm talking about abstracts for conferences specifically. So if you're writing a manuscript or a thesis or a dissertation, you will have an abstract as part of that paper, right? That is written in a similar but somewhat different format. So today we're just going to be focusing on writing and effectively communicating abstracts for conference proceedings, conference presentations, or like a 3-minute thesis or the graduate research symposium that's coming up at the end of the semester. And so when we look at what we're gonna do today, I'm gonna again talk a little bit just about abstracts, give some basic overview of the components for abstracts. It sounds like there's varying level of experience with writing and presenting. So I'll try to cover as many bases as possible, but also understand where all of you are at. I'm going to kind of guide you through a journey, if you will, about how to effectively write and communicate your abstracts. And then finally, we're going to go through a couple of examples and then have a lot of time at the end for question and answer. And really, honestly, to be able to talk about whatever you want for the time we have. So when we look at the purpose of an abstract, there's really 4 things that the abstract intends to do, right? So if you think about this from conference proceedings, right? Typically, the abstracts are available before the conference occurs, right? So first and most importantly, the abstract summarizes a research project that you've done, right? The key word is summarize. It's not the entire research project, and it's not all of the data that you ever collected on this project. It's a summary of the research, right? And it highlights key findings. It highlights the most important things. So for those of you who are completing a thesis, maybe you ran like 50 different types of analyses, or you did a mixed method study and you did both qualitative and quantitative analysis. You may only be presenting one or the other, or you may be only presenting a portion of your data, right? In some cases, like plenary sessions or opportunities that are not poster presentations or that are longer than 5 minutes, right? You can present more data. But in 5 minutes, like on a poster, someone's going to spend 2 to 5 minutes at a poster. Or if you have a face-to-face presentation, like our students right now are just getting their notifications of their presentations at our national conference in June. They have 5 minutes, all inclusive, to present whatever they want, right? And so if you try to go through your entire thesis or your entire dissertation in 5 minutes, it's going to be bad. People are going to be bored, and you're not going to leave a good impression, right? So it highlights the key findings. If you could pick the most important thing that you would want one person to leave with, that's what an abstract is designed to do. The abstract, from a conference proceeding perspective, is also to be attractive and pique people's interest, to get people really interested in what you're doing. So when the conference day comes and you have a poster from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., that people are going to want to say, oh, I want to stop by Khalid's poster because it sounds really interesting to me, right? Oh, I'm doing a similar project. I want to go and ask this person a question. Very rarely are they going to talk to you about what's actually in the poster, right? They may ask you a couple questions like, what did you find? But they also want to spend time talking with you about the other insights you've gained and essentially the invitation for them to come and for them to, it's like kind of like dating, right? Like the invitation for them to come is based off of what you put in that abstract. Like if you're attractive in the abstract, right, they're going to want to come and spend time with you, right? And then finally, this kind of ties up to the first part about summarizing your research. But at the end of the day, we all think we want to do important research. We're not doing this just to do it, right? I have one of my favorite articles is from 1963. It's an article, and if you ever get a chance to look it up, it's called "Chaos in the Brickyard." Okay. And essentially in 1963, I can't remember, the last name of the author is Forshine. And he was talking about how right now, and this was in the 1960s, in scientific research, people are just producing bricks, right? They're just producing things. So the bricks are the research papers. So people are just producing research papers, but no one is actually understanding how brick 1 fits with brick 2, or brick 2 fits with brick 3, and then we start stacking them, right? And so people are trying to build like sculptures, or people are trying to build bridges, or people are trying to build buildings with a bunch of random objects that don't necessarily go together, because people are just producing bricks because someone told them they had to make a brick to graduate, or someone told them they had to, this is what you needed to do to earn tenure, or this is what you needed to do to earn a job. And I think that abstracts and research in general should be purposeful. Like, no one's going to change the world with one piece of research. Like, your abstract is not going to change the world, even if you think it's the coolest thing you've ever done, right? You could cure cancer and it's not going to change the world in an abstract, right? One study is not going to do that. But what you can do is commit to making a really clean, symmetrical brick that has clear connection points from where what the brick you want to connect to that's already been done, and the brick you want to go to next. So everything can, so then someone else or you in the future can put those bricks together to make something that's memorable, or right, that actually can change the world. And so I think an abstract has the opportunity to convey the significance of your work in that perspective. So when we look at what parts are in an abstract, I had to put an asterisk here because every discipline is different. Some disciplines have what are called structured abstracts. Some disciplines have unstructured abstracts. Some disciplines have abstracts that are 100 words. Some abstracts have abstracts, or some disciplines have abstracts, or conferences have abstracts that are 1,000 words. Sometimes they're between 200 and 500. Like, it all is different. And for that specific advice, it's going to depend on where you're presenting, what type of presentation it is, right? If you're going to a regional presentation versus a national or international conference, right? They may have different requirements. Like when I presented in my athletic training and healthcare conference, I have 500 words if it's a qualitative study, and I have 450 words if it's a quantitative study. So there are all these different components, but in general, there are 5 sections, right? And those sections are like an introduction or a context, like a background of the information, the objective or the purpose of the study, the methods, so how you went about completing your study, what you found in the results, and finally, the conclusions or implications. So like, what does this research mean? And we're going to go through over the next several slides, we're going to go through kind of each of those and how to effectively prepare each of those sections. Now, this is good, like when you actually go do this in real life, you're going to need to talk to your research advisor, and because they have the experience perhaps presenting to that conference, right? And also always go back to the guidelines. Like, I think that's like, before we even get to the components of the abstract, when you're thinking about presenting an abstract or you want to go present your research, go to the website, and there's usually going to be several pages of exactly how you have to do it. 12-point font, single spaced, no more than 7,000 characters, including spaces, right? Can you add a table? Can you not have a table? Are you allowed to have citations in your abstract? Are you not allowed to have citations in your abstract? Like, all of those components are detailed by the conference or detailed by the review committee. And so I think you always want to use that as the guiding document for creating your abstract, right? But these in general are what conferences or organizations are going to ask for to be included in your abstract. So when we look at the introduction, and I'm going to try to do this through like mountains and landscapes and travel destinations, okay? So the pictures here are kind of like are tied to how I want you to think about each one of these sections. So the introduction is kind of is like getting a landscape. So taking a wide lens and looking at what's out there, right? And so what this does, the key point of the introduction is to provide context of your research. That's what it's all about. It's saying like, in what space does this research exist? Because if no one knows in what space this research exists, it's easy to say for someone to say, well, they've already done this. Like this research has already been done. This isn't original, right? But if we're talking specifically, like if I talk about, I don't know, stress in graduate students, right? Someone's going to say, well, we've already studied stress in graduate students. But if I'm able to say, since the COVID-19 pandemic, right, graduate students have experienced, international graduate students have experienced an unusual level of stress when entering United States universities because of visa requirements, backlogs, et cetera, et cetera. That provides, that tells me, right, what my camera lens is looking at. I'm not taking a picture of the entire globe, right? Because you take a picture of the entire globe, you're like, yeah, of course oceans exist. Of course there are continents. But if you zoom in your camera and you say, okay, this is the angle that I'm taking a picture of, you can see, like in this picture, we're talking about this mountain in context to these valleys in this river, and this is what my research is this is what this research is talking about. Usually in an abstract, this is only 1 to 2 sentences, right? So when I got 450 word abstract, a 300 to 450 word abstract, this is 1 to 2 sentences. So it takes a little bit of time to distill that message down. So, but when you're writing it, it may start out as a paragraph. Like in your manuscript, you have like maybe, if you in your dissertation or your thesis, you have like a whole chapter called introduction, right? But for an abstract, you have to get that, 20 pages, perhaps 10 pages, even in a research manuscript, right? You've got 2 pages at least, right? You have to get that down to 1 or 2 sentences. And that's oftentimes a really hard place for students. What I've noticed in my students is they want to write about something that we all already know, right? Like athletic training is important, or, teaching and learning is important, right? Like, yes, but the context also requires a little bit of understanding of the type of conference you're presenting at. Like you're going to present an Earth and quaternary science conference, right? Like with Dr. Spear, you're doing something maybe like climate change or something like that, right? So you probably don't need to tell me why climate change is important, right? Because everyone at the conference knows that climate change is important. What you want to do is narrow in about, I'm sorry, you're teaching and learning. You're not, you're higher education. Okay, yeah, all right, sorry. Both in the College of Ed, we're okay. You don't need to tell the whole audience that climate change is important. You don't need to spend the 1 or 2 sentences you have to say that climate change is a thing, right? You can narrow that down much quicker because everyone reading your abstract is already walking into that conference or walking into opening, like no one's gonna read a journal that if they're not interested in whatever you're talking about, whatever your discipline is, right? So you don't have to do that. Then you look at the next section, which is the objective, aims, or purpose statement. And when I think about this, this is like the destination you are trying to reach in the context of the landscape you've created, right? So this is a picture of a castle in Germany, right? This first picture here, and also, this picture is in the mountains, right? So it's a castle in the mountains in Germany. Before that, I didn't tell you we were going to a castle. I said, we are going to the mountains and this is where we live. Specifically, I'm going to study, and we're going to look at this small portion of that bigger landscape, right? To study these specific effects. I'm only going, so we are only studying climate change, or not climate change, I don't know. What's your area? Give me a brief 1-sentence synopsis of your area.
So my area is effect of climate change on tree growth.
Okay, tree growth. Okay, so you're talking about how, maybe in your context, you're talking about how trees hold information about climate change. That's something, and the second one, you're gonna say, the purpose of this study is to study the effects of temperature change on tree ring of this specific type of tree, and these rings in this specific area.
Yeah.
Right? So you said in the context, you said trees hold information. Now you're saying this specific tree, this specific measure, and this specific thing that I'm temperature, this specific thing that I'm looking for, right? So you've narrowed that down a lot, right? If you think about it as a funnel, can I write on this? I think this is writable, right? Right? You think about this as a funnel, your intro is really broad, right? But and then you get pretty narrow for your purpose. And it happens pretty quickly. Like this is one to two sentences. Then your purpose is one sentence, right? So you should be able to have 1 to 2 sentences on the intro. Here's the broad space, and then narrow down very quickly to have a single sentence, okay? And that's your purpose. The purpose of this study is to A, B, C, and D, right? Or the purpose of the study is A measured by B, right? Sometimes when you're in this space, the transition between the introduction and the purpose, a writing trick that I like to do, and it also helps our students, is to identify the gap in the literature, right? So what this means is what's missing from the literature that your question answers, right? So it could be so I don't know. Climate change is important, right? Trees hold information, and then you're studying tree rings, right? This is, while we know, well, you know, like, while evidence supports that tree rings hold information regarding global temperatures, it's unknown of the impact that this has in sub-Saharan Africa.
Tropics, yeah.
Yeah, something like that, right? So what you've done is you said, okay, this is what we know. So where you're coming from, this is where I want to go. This is the purpose of my study. And the reason I'm doing this study is because we don't know the effects in this specific area, right?
Yeah.
And so usually how this is structured is it's like a sentence it says, while we know this, this, and this, we don't know these other things. Therefore, the purpose of this study is insert your purpose. So it's still one sentence, but that's usually what happens in this kind of transition period. That's not necessarily required, but I do find it, particularly for people who are creating abstracts for the first couple times, is that being able to state this gap in the literature just helps with flow and helps the presenter, you all, understand how you're getting from the big picture to your small project. Okay. Any questions so far?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
I'm actually in the process of getting my thesis for my dissertation, and I faced the same issue when I stated the background or like why I'm going to talk specifically about this topic. And just a few weeks ago, I struggled to transition from the background. This is the general topic. This is what the general public know, and to transition from that to my specific subject. I felt that my abstract needed like some sentence or something that can take the reader from more general landscape to a specific one. So that's actually interesting. I'm just, when you mentioned that, excuse me, when you mentioned that we need, for example, to, like we stated the general aspect of the subject, and in order to be specific, we have to mention why we chose this specific subject. But I think since we haven't conducted the study yet, it would be a little bit misleading if we said that, hey, we don't know this yet. This is why I'm going to look for it. Maybe some discrepancies at the end.
That's okay, right? Like, so, because that's the whole point of the science, right? That's the whole point of doing the research, right? Like, we believe, right? It's all there. This is also kind of where you're inferring some hypotheses. I know, like in the formal thesis writing process or dissertation writing process, you're going to actually have to spell out your hypotheses and null hypotheses, et cetera. But in the writing, like, you're essentially saying, here's the gap, right? So you're like, it's like, You have like on this end of the cliff, right? You have what you know. And then this end is what I think, right? You have to now build a bridge from what has already been known, what the research already says, to what you think. This is your hypothesis. This is why you're doing the study, right? It could be that when you get into this, you actually, like when you start to do the study, and then this is your study, right? Actually, this is why you do the study. So the gap in the, but we don't know, right? It could actually have to go this way first and then go down, right? Like we don't know that this is exactly the way that the research is going to fall. But this right here is the gap. This, I mean, it's called the gap in the research, right? And the gap in the research is essentially the rationale of why you do your study. And a lot of times, particularly in like areas that haven't been studied a lot, we just don't know, right? Like we don't like, and again, like what's your research, your teaching and learning, your curriculum instruction, what's your research area?
So just active learning theory principle.
Okay.
I wanted to like mix them or like see how teachers use them in the universal design learning framework in the campus learning system.
Okay, so it's like, okay, so we know that active learning strategies on their own work. We also know that universal design has some evidence to support it. What we think is that if, I'm gonna assume that you're doing this because you think that active learning strategies within universal design are going to improve student outcomes. Right? That's what you think.
Yeah.
But here's what we don't know. We don't know the effects. We don't know if when you combine active learning strategy and universal design, if there are positive benefits. Therefore, the purpose of this study is to do this, this, and this, right? Like, and so I think that's where you kind of have to, particularly when you're in this stage here about what you know, and then that background literature area, that literature search, and when you're starting to translate that, even if you've already done the study, right, and you're writing the abstract on the back end, you still need to be able to communicate it, right? Before or after. It's just like regardless of when you write this, whether you're writing it prospectively before the study is started and you're in the proposal place, or you're in the defense space, or you're in I'm going to present this at a conference space, you still need to be able to justify why you did your study, right? And so identifying that gap, which kind of occurs between the introduction and the purpose, right? Usually as a transition sentence or as a transition clause, is really important, is critically important because that's the hook, right? That's what's going to get someone to come to your research, to want to do, if you're on the proposal side, want to do your research, that's going to get your committee members on board. If you're at the presentation side or the audience side, that's going to get people to want to come. Because they're like, oh yeah, I've thought about that too. I wonder what would happen if I include universal design and active learning strategies, right? I've always wondered about what happens in the tropics in terms of how climate change is affecting tree growth or something, right? Like I don't mean to diminish. I just have no clue about tree. That seems like a very complex field. So I'm just, you know what I mean? Like, but people in your area be like, oh yeah, well, we know how it works in North America, but we don't know how it works in Ecuador. I don't know, right? Like, and I've always wondered if there are differences because of 20,000 different variables that could be different between Indiana and Ecuador, right? And that's really why you're doing your research, right? Because your larger purpose, maybe you want to show that there is a global effect on climate change on tree growth rate or something, right? And you want to show that there are strategies that may be better if we combine them. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to stack some of the things that we already know how to do, right? And maybe if we stack, we can improve outcomes. Or if they don't stack together, then it's cool if you do it, but if you don't have the time, energy, and resources, you don't have to do it, right?
I just feel like we need to have like have some reading and know a little bit about the literature review about the subject to try at least be on the right side, like for example, universal design and active learning theory can be very effective if combined in a learning management system. And from a teacher perspective, it's easy to combine the both. So that's an assumption that we can put, and sometimes it's not really supported in the literature review. So you may just put it there, and at the end, it's not going to be very accurate.
But that's valuable too.
Yeah.
Because so there's valuable. So I think oftentimes. So I know we're kind of getting off the subject here, but does anyone find this not valuable? Like I can just get back to this. Are we okay? Are we okay?
Yeah.
Like still to kind of just like free form in this a little bit?
Of course, yeah.
Right, I'll make sure we get through all the objectives. But there is value in insignificant results. Right? So if you, like there is value in finding the things that don't work. Right? I think oftentimes, particularly for graduate students, and scientific journals are biased in this way. Scientific journals want to publish significant results, things that were positive. But wouldn't it be really, really valuable for a teacher or a college university professor or a second grade teacher to know that combining these things don't make any difference? Right? So there's value in insignificant results, like non-statistically or biologically or clinically significant results. There's value in that because that tells us, again, or it doesn't matter. Like not that it's not good, but it's not bad. Like so it does no harm. Like insignificant results do no harm, which is also so if that's like the style you like to do, like if you're a teacher who likes to integrate technology and learning management systems and universal design and all these things, and that's your vibe, you know that you're not hurting your students. Right? So there's value in that. But also if you're a really stressed out teacher who has zero time, who lacks resources, and you're just trying to make it through the day, you're also not doing any harm by not incorporating all those things. Right? I think we live in a world that we value addition, but we don't value subtraction. I think there's value. I think there is a way we can be additive to society by subtracting. Knowing all of the things that don't work or that are non-significant is just as important as knowing the things that are significant. Right? And I know that kind of goes, that was specifically towards like intervention style studies, but it's the same thing for like observational studies, right? Like it's important to know if tree rings operate differently in the tropics versus temperate climates, because perhaps temperate climates are more sensitive to climate change. So maybe tree rings are now the tool, the measurement device we look for in climate change, right? And so we want to make sure that we are, I don't know, using temperate climate trees to measure climate change, right? Or again, if the sensitivity of measuring climate change is the same in the tropics versus the temperate regions of the Earth, then that's okay too. Or the Arctic, right? Like again, all these things that I'm just kind of making up on top of my head right now. So, but I don't feel like you're misleading people, or don't feel like you're misleading people. You're being dishonest if you don't know what the results are already going to be.
Yeah, I guess the feeling is like when you attract the reader to a certain objective, and at the end it's going to be not what he's expected. We perceive it as a failure of the research. But thank you for clarifying.
It's not a fail, because hopefully that is valuable to the reader, because they can have like a light bulb moment and say like, wow, I've always thought this was going to be better, but this isn't better now. It's like there's so many things, right? Like it's like for gas, right? Like everyone wants to put the high octane gas into their car, right? Look, it's way, if I use the expensive gas, that's way better than using the cheap gas, right? That would be the assumption, because more is better.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right?
so you have to get the assumption right. So you better focus on the assumptions and make sure that you're sound.
Right. And even if you get the assumptions wrong, now you've developed a new research and the next research project with different assumptions.
Okay.
right?
What I also think is that in this instance, then to make the work vital, it largely depends on how you communicate your outcome. Because to make your outcome relevant is dependent on you. Like you say, okay, there was no change. Then how do you communicate to the reader the importance of your work? Now, the work tells you that teachers who are unable to, integrate maybe advanced technological knowledge into teaching and learning practice, and let me use that, it doesn't really make an impact on the job if you are able to make use of what you are able to do. So it's your traditional way being impactful in your classroom practices that's important than maybe stressing yourself on what you may not know to jeopardize your teaching and learning practices in classrooms. So I think that it depends largely on how you communicate or you are interpreting your outcome to the audience.
That's right.
Absolutely, and that's you're a great segue. Thank you. I mean, we had a couple more slides to get there, but I'm getting exactly to your point here a little later. So the next section in the abstract is the methods, right? And this is usually what most graduate students get most comfortable with, right? The introduction, they're kind of just like, they feel like they're just making stuff up, right? The results, they're hoping their research advisor helped them with the stats enough. But the methods, I think a lot of people get into science, right? Or go earn masters or PhDs because they're type A personalities and they like to have like, this is what you do, like procedures, like this is what we're going to do. So typically the method section is, when I'm advising students, is the section that I need to cut down the most because people want to put their entire methods. So it's like 500 words of just methods, right? And so the methods, in general, is how you did the study. So what were the things that you did? Now, in an abstract versus a full manuscript, you are not trying to have people be able to read your abstract and 100% replicate your study. If they want to replicate your study, they're going to have to read your dissertation or thesis or research paper, like your published research paper. Like abstracts are not designed to communicate, like to be the sole document for replication. What you want to be able to do again, depending on what your results look like, in 3 to 5 sentences, right? You want to be able to concisely articulate what you did. So an individual who is familiar with your area of study has confidence that you're just not making it up, right? So if someone's doing a qualitative study, so doing interviews, right? You want to make sure you say you developed a semi-structured interview script, that you want to say what type of, you're using a consensual qualitative research tradition with triangulation and member checking, right? Like you want to get, again, if you have no clue about qualitative research, you're like, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? And I'm sure there are some, from a tree ring perspective, there's some key language that is almost in every research article about the methodology that you're using that would make sense to people who are familiar with that area of research, right? And like I said, usually in this section, the challenge is that people write too much, right? And then it's a matter of cutting it down, and that's kind of a collaboration between you and your research advisor or your co-presenter, because I think your research advisor is your research advisor for a reason, that they have some experience in that, right? And so working with them on cutting that down to being the essential information, but I think in general it's 3 to 5 sentences, depending on how much you're able to use, or like how much space you actually have. In some abstract presentation styles, they just ask research design. So it's like cross-sectional study, right? Like that, and that's, so you get like 2 words, right? Or qualitative research design, or observational study, or whatever that is. So it's very basic, right? But in others they do ask for a little bit more detail. And so the results, when we continue to use this kind of like mountain analogy, the results are like you've made it to the peak, you've made it to your destination. What's the most important thing you want to share with your audience, right? And so typically in an abstract, the results is the bulkiest section. You have the most space to play with in the results, okay? And usually what's required, at least in my area of research, is you have to talk about the types of participants or samples that you used. What were their characteristics? We used athletic trainers with 5 years of experience, 25 were men, 13 were women, 12 were preferred not to say, whatever that is, right? Whatever your demographic data are, or whatever the basic information is. And then ordering your results based off of importance. Because you have to understand, like I mentioned before, you may not be able to present all of your results in an abstract. You may only get to pick one variable, maybe 2 variables that you want to present. And so, typically, again, when we have our students do this, they can write out all their results, but we tell them to order it, not in the order that you collected the data, but in the order of importance that you think is important, right? So maybe the most important thing is that drinking coffee helps you improve your test scores. That's the most important thing. You also found that the type of cup matters and that if it's cold or hot matters. But the bottom line is if you drink coffee, regardless if it's hot, cold, drinking out of a Yeti or a plastic cup, you're going to have better test scores, right? Like that's what you want to present. And then hopefully you'll have a research publication, a paper published later, and then they can get all those other details, right? Like that's where they can get all these other things. Now, if you have enough space, then you go to the next important one. The next most important thing I want to share with you is that if you drink hot coffee, it's better than cold coffee in improving test scores. And then you probably don't have any more room after that, right? But you could follow that same pattern. But this, again, this comes in conversations with your research advisor in terms of, and I think also it goes back to the purpose, right? If your purpose is to study, so your purpose is to study the combination. And if you found that in individuals who implemented active learning by itself and individuals who implemented universal design by itself, they both saw improved outcomes. But what your research purpose was to see the combined effect. You should first report, if it was positive, negative, or neutral, what the combined effect was, because that's what your research project was, right? If your research project was specifically about temperature, right? I don't like temperature changes, not soil acidity or 10,000 other variables that you could measure. You want to present the temperature data first, or the spacing between the rings first, as opposed to all of these other variables that may be important, but not as important.
So can we say it's supposed to clearly be tied to like the objectives, like nothing else?
It should be. That's where you should start, right? Like that's where it needs, because what you've done, right, is you're like, again, we think about this like a dating profile, like Bumble or Tinder or something, right? You're like, hey, here's my picture, here's all I'm about, right? And then you don't want them to get to the results here and be like, that is not what you told me you were going to tell me about, right? That's just disappointment. Like, so you want to present the results that are most tied to your objectives. You may have found all sorts of other things, but the reason you did this study was X. You need to be presenting X results first, not Z or Y or A. Right? Now, you may have collected Z, Y, and A as well, right? And that's all fine. And if you have space, you can talk about them. And you will definitely talk about them in your paper, right? But for the purposes of this abstract, you need to make sure that whatever you say that your purpose is, you are reporting, or that your purpose or objective is, you are reporting first what outcome matches your purpose.
So can the objectives considered as the research question?
Yeah, so objectives, purpose, yeah, aims, that would be the research question, or the reason you're doing the study. Like, I want to study the effects of A, B, and C on X, Y, and Z. You should first present X, Y, and Z results.
Get the answers from
Exactly. Exactly. And then after you present the results, this last piece, which is the conclusions or implications or clinical significance, or in some abstracts they call it the discussion, but usually they don't call it a discussion because you don't have enough space, right? But if we think about our journey up the mountain to our results, we've gotten there and now we've walked back. Now you've separated yourself from doing the study, and kind of like this guy in this picture, right? You're reflecting on the journey. What was most important from what I just did? Like, what was the most important takeaway? If someone asked me, what did you learn about climbing that mountain? You probably wouldn't say, well, I learned how not to fall down a mountain, or like I learned how to put my foot in front of the other, or I learned this specific rock climbing technique, right? You probably say something like, I learned that no matter how difficult it gets, I can still keep going. I may need to change directions or do this, this, and this, right? You're probably going to have some bigger picture, some bigger reason why you completed the journey, right? Like, and that's what you want to share in the conclusions. You want to share kind of the why, and why, more importantly, why does this matter? Right? Why did your research matter? Your research didn't matter because you combined techniques. Your research mattered for some other reason. Your research mattered not because you measured tree rings. People have been cutting down trees and observing tree rings for like a long time. Why does your research matter? Like, that's the question you have to be able to answer. And how do your results fit in to the rest of the results that have existed, right? So we think about it, it's like a puzzle piece. Not only are you connecting backwards, right? Not only have you connected to the piece that's already been laid, you also have these ridges and these unique parts about your research that hopefully are going to connect to someone else. But your job in the implications is to be able to communicate that so that person who is going to do the next part of your research can find it, right? It may be you, right? But I'm going to guess that there are more people on this planet than just you who are studying universal design and active learning. I'm going to get, and I know Dr. Spear studies tree rings too. So I'm going to guess that there's more than just you on this planet studying tree rings, right? We all want to think, particularly from a faculty perspective, we all want to think that we're the only person doing this research. And so obviously this is the next study that I'm going to do, and the next study that I'm going to do after that. But in reality, we all work within our own little specialty areas in our own communities. So it may not be me who does the next study, but I need to be able to articulate why the results and what I found matter, right? If we go back to this example, right? If we use this gap, essentially we've done the study. And so what you've done, why this matters is now you've built a bridge. Now you can get from point A to point B, where before there was no way to get to point A to point B. You also may find, again, like you also may find that if it's an insignificant result, that this isn't the bridge. And then what you've done is now you've said, well, maybe we need to go over here, and there's a bridge here, and then there needs to be another study that bridges to get us to this next phase, like what I thought was going to happen, right? Or maybe it's 100 little steps, right? 100 little connections. Who knows how many it's going to be, right? But that's what this section is all about. Now, honestly, in an abstract, when I read an abstract, I read the introduction and the conclusion. I know on Thursday I'm giving a presentation about how to read a scientific paper, and I read scientific papers totally different than I read abstracts. But I don't care what you found in an abstract. I care about what it means. That's what's going to get me to come. right? Like, I don't care if you drive on a dating profile. I don't care if you drive a Honda or a Lamborghini, right? I care about if you're a good person, right? Like, I don't care about the individual, and like, yes, maybe that's like long-term relationship, that's gonna make a difference. But like, for me to swipe left or right or however way you swipe, it's not gonna matter, right? And that's what this is all about. You have to, when you think about also how, when you read abstracts, even if you're reading paper abstracts, are you getting caught up in the details of the methods? Not usually, unless you are reading for the methods, right? Unless you're looking for how to do methods in your own paper or in your own project. You're looking at the introduction, and you're looking about what this means. And that's usually the difference between a really interesting research paper and abstract and something that's like, meh, I don't need this anymore. Right? How many times have you read a conclusion part of an abstract and you're like, okay, I don't need to read anymore. This doesn't matter to me. Or like, if you've had the ability to go to a conference and you've been looking at the abstracts, you're like, oh, that's interesting, but I don't need to go because it's not related to what I want to learn about, right? So that's really how people are going to decide on whether or not they're going to choose to stop by your abstract. And honestly, as a journal reviewer, that's what I'm looking for, because I want my readers, from a publishing perspective, who like someone who's been on a review committee, that the abstracts go into a peer-reviewed journal. Like, I'm looking at that and say, I want my readers who pay subscription fees to be able to gain value from the 500 abstracts we put into this edition of a journal. Right? Like, if it's going to take space in my journal and I print out my journal, it's gotta have some meaning, right? And I think this goes back, I'm sorry, what was your name, sir?
Ebenezer.
Ebenezer. I think this goes back to what Ebenezer's point was. Regardless of your results, positive, negative, neutral, significant, insignificant, somewhere in between, right? It's how you interpret your results and create meaning from your results that's going to make the difference. Right? We'll go through this, and then I can't remember exactly how many I have, but we'll go through this and then have some more conversation after this. So I think, over the next couple slides, I'm going to be talking about these areas. I'll go over some of them a little faster than others because I feel like we've hit on some of the things like conciseness and clarity. But when we talk about being concise and clear, this is the art of writing an abstract. Like, I mean, this is totally how you get better at this is by writing abstracts. How you get good at writing short is by producing a lot of volume, right? I will say if I go back to the start of my career, the first abstract I wrote when I was a master's student, I probably wrote 1,000 words for a 300-word abstract. And my advisor was like, you got to cut this down. You got to cut this down. And her nickname was the Shredder. Right? Like, she's like deleting like entire sections of my like, you don't need any of this, right? And that is really, and if you want to have a career where you're producing abstracts more than just to earn your degree, like, getting good at cutting is what is going to make you a better abstract writer, right? I think oftentimes when we write our actual papers or our theses or our dissertations, our research advisors are like, can you give me a little more detail? Can you summarize this a little better? Can you synthesize this? Have you considered this paper by this author, right? And so it's usually, again, it's adding, right? And I talked about this earlier, but I think there's a lot of value from addition through subtraction. And so if you're over, before you send it to your advisor, let's say you're over 500 words, you go through and try to cut it, right? And also, when you send it to your advisor for review, don't be upset if they totally destroy it, right? Like, that's part of the process.
Yeah.
Like, now, like, again, it's been, 2011 or 2010 was when I wrote my first abstract. It's been 14 years. Like, I struggle to get to the word count because I'm like, I can just say this in a sentence. I'll just say this in a sentence, right? Like, and so part now it's like I need to write more so it doesn't look like so it looks like I have enough. But it's funny how like you can swing on the spectrum, even though these topics that I'm talking about now are really way more exciting to me than the neurophysiology that I did when I was a master's student, right? I've gotten into the routine so much of cutting from observing all of my students. Like all of my students, like I'm probably the shredder for all of my students, right? Like I'm just destroying their papers over and over and over again, saying this is, why do you have this? Like you don't need any of this, just delete all of this, right? Why are you using 3 sentences when you can explain it in 3 words, right? Like, so being concise and clear, I think is more of an art and something that comes from experience than anything else. I can't give you a tip to say, write clearer. Like if you've ever had a research advisor do that, I know your frustration. Like, can you just make this more clear? No, if I knew, I would have done that already. But it just comes from experience. When we talk about using descriptive language, I think the descriptive language and avoiding jargon, they kind of go back to back. But using descriptive language, we want to be able to use language that we want to use precise language. So an example is an example would be like someone, if you're writing and you say, there are a variety of factors. There are a variety of factors that influence this. Don't tell me that there are a variety. What is a variety? How many is a variety? What does a variety mean? Right? It's easy. I mean, so again, that's a little like either state the number of factors that influence it, or state that there's an unknown number of factors. Don't tell me there's a variety. Also, try not to use what I'll call baggage words. So there are certain words that often convey different meanings or meanings. So I'm thinking like, has anyone ever read or heard someone say there's a dearth of literature in this area? Like there's a dearth of literature in the area of computer mouse design. When you can just say there's not a lot of research. There's just a little research. You don't have to use these like $10 words for a 5-cent phrase, right? Like it can be effective without being overly wordy or without being too jargony as well. So again, descriptive language, this is one of those things that I think you get better with by reading others' abstracts. So if you have an author that you particularly like, right? Or if you're in a PhD program with Dr. Spear, I know you're not in a PhD program, but if you were in the PhD program with Dr. Spear, I would read Dr. Spear's writing, right? Read all the abstracts he's produced, because that gives you an idea of how he likes to write. Because there is a science to technical writing, but it's also an art, right? And again, I think that we get better at using descriptive language the more the more abstracts or papers we read to know how others in the field are communicating, right? Maybe the word dearth is something that you're supposed to use in educational research, right? But in healthcare research, dearth is an unnecessary word. And the other side of this is to avoid jargon. So this is really hard, right? This is hard in scientific communication because like you were talking about earlier today, that how do you communicate or how do you make sure that people want to come to your presentation or people want to come to your abstract? If you use technical jargon that people are not going to understand, you're only going to get technical people to show up at your presentation, right? And this can be, this is not so much of a concern for writing abstracts because you have so little space, but when you do start to write manuscripts or you start to write your theses, right? If I said something like, I'm going to try to come up with something off the top of my head, like, we use the Moon method of repair to to complete the ACL revision using an allograph. Allograph. Would anyone know what that means? Like, if I told that to another athletic trainer, they would know exactly what I'm talking about, right? As opposed to say, I could say, we used a minimally invasive surgical procedure to repair the ACL ligament. Like, that's totally different, right? That's what it is. So the moon procedure is a non-invasive procedure to do an ACL reconstruction, right? If you were vaguely familiar with the human body or you watch sports, you know what the ACL is. You may not know everything about it, but the difference between saying a minimally invasive surgical procedure and the moon procedure is jargon. Like, the moon is jargon, right? Moon essentially is another word for, not moon. Moon is the person who develops the non-invasive procedure. I'm sure there are different levels in this for each of our areas. Like, I'm thinking like someone in the education space, right? Evolution of consciousness theory states this, and this versus self-authorship theory, right? Not many people know about evolution of consciousness, but self-authorship theory is something that almost everyone in education knows about, right? Particularly on the student affairs side of things, right? And so it's just about shifting that language. And again, I can't give you specific examples in everyone's field, but if you've ever read a paper and you're like, I have to go look up what that means, that's probably jargon, right? So a way you could do this is if you have another colleague who's still a graduate student, may still be in like the general field, but may not be in specifically your area of study, ask them to read it and ask them to highlight every word they don't understand, right? And then all those words that they don't understand, explain it to them, and then use those words that you just explained it to them with, right? I don't know what that is for everyone's field, but like for you, if you had a colleague who's in biology, right? Ask a biologist to read this and highlight, a biology student to read it and highlight everything that they don't understand, and then explain it to them, but use the words that you use to explain it to them in your abstract, right? And I think higher education administration and curriculum instruction, those are similar enough, but they're not the same, right? Student affairs, sorry. We talked about this earlier, but so I won't spend too much time on this, but highlighting the key points. This is where at the discussion, or not the discussion, but the conclusion, this is where that's critically important. And then also, usually in an abstract, you have the opportunity to add keywords, right? That's going to help people find your abstract. When you write keywords for an abstract, don't use words that are already in your abstract or that are in the title. And the reason is because think about this as like Google. This is how people are going to find your abstract. So Google Scholar, PubMed, any of the databases, when they pull abstracts, they use all of the words in the abstract and the title. So if you search, I don't know, active learning design, right, or active learning strategies, and that's in your title, or it's written somewhere in your paper, if you put active learning as a keyword, you're not expanding your reach. That means someone who searches active learning who would already find your paper because of the title or because of the words you have in your abstract. So maybe you use something like, I don't know, student-centered approaches, right? Because student-centered approaches isn't in your title, and student-centered approaches aren't in your writing. What that's going to do is when you have someone who's looking for research that may be related to active learning, but they type in student-centered strategies, now they're going to find your research, right? And so that expands your reach. So if you think about it from how others will use your research, use keywords that are not part of your title or your abstract. And that's kind of like an insider secret. The only reason I know that is because I'm a senior editor on a journal that we run through Indiana State. So we I know on the background what Google and all of the databasing indexing software uses to pull to how people find it. So when you highlight those key points and keywords, make sure you're using ones if your journal offers that, or if your abstract offers that. And that same goes with when you're actually on the submission page. So let's say, I don't know, the Tree Ring and Climate Science Conference in Honolulu. When you submit your paper or when you submit your abstract, you have to go to a portal and you have to click like areas of study or keywords or areas of interest, right? Select areas of interest that are related, but may not be directly like exactly what you're using in your paper. Because that's, again, that's the metadata. The metadata, when they pull that out and they actually publish it and they make it publicly available, that's what Google is going to pull out. So when people are on Google Scholar, or people are on PubMed, or people are on EBSCOhost, that's how others are going to find your work, right? And again, citations or H-indexes or anything like that are important. That's going to help increase the number of citations of your work. One thing that I always hate as a journal reviewer is errors, like proofreading errors, right? And so this is something that with a little bit of planning can be avoided altogether, right? Making sure you proofread for errors and making sure that you're working with your research advisor or someone who's unrelated to, or just another graduate student, asking them to trade, do some peer review. If you do peer review, not only are you going to get better at reading papers, you're also going to get better at writing papers, because you can identify styles and techniques that others use, or styles and techniques that others are really bad at, and no, I'm not going to do that. Again, you can learn through people not being successful just as much as you can learn through people being successful. I think the other thing that is helpful, particularly now, so, and this is going to be controversial, so if your research advisor is totally against you having anything but your brain or someone else's brain help you, do not do this, okay? But you can, like, there's Grammarly. Grammarly can help make sentences more concise. It's not changing the content. It's not taking anyone's intellectual property or intellectual work away or changing it. You can also do it, like, since Indiana State's a Microsoft school, if you go to the Edge browser and you download and you sign into Indiana State's account, you can have access to Copilot, which is Microsoft's version of AI. And you can ask it to review your abstract and make it more concise, or check it for grammatical errors. I'm saying that, again, you're not asking it to rewrite it. There's a difference between asking AI to write your abstract and you do nothing. That's plagiarism and probably not above board, right? But if you've already written your abstract and you just want some like grammatical help, what's the difference between asking AI to help you and going to the writing center, which some of you may be a GA for the writing center, right? Like going to the writing center and having them help you, or having Grammarly help you, or having, like, even if you have like Control or F7, right? In Microsoft Word, that's AI in a different sense, that's spell checking you, right? So we're okay with spell check, but we're not okay with Grammarly, or we're not okay with Copilot, right? So I would encourage you, if everyone's okay with it, to be using those strategies. Again, I think it's a little fishy if you give it an abstract and say rewrite this better, right? That's probably a little too much. But if you've written it and you just ask Copilot or ChatGPT to scan the document for errors and suggest improvements for clarity, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's actually how we can use AI to improve science, right? As opposed to this being a threat to science and a threat to what we're doing in terms of scholarly writing. And I bring that into the proofread part because I really think that is where technology can help us, right? Particularly if you're a non-native English speaker, right? I mean, I think that's critically important, because oftentimes you're going to have native English speakers reading your paper. And as much as I'd like to say that native English speakers are not biased towards non-native English speakers, I've seen it happen too often, in which there is someone who's writing, that appears to be a non-native English speaker because of the way the language is structured, and regardless of the quality of the work or the science, they are rejected. Right? I'm not naive enough to believe that that doesn't happen.
I noticed one of my colleagues, they submitted a paper to a journal. The journal required them to send their paper to a native speaker and pay, I think, $500 to get it nativized. They said the science is fine, but the language is too non-native.
Right.
So let's just have it clear. So they paid $500 to another native speaker of English to nativize the language.
So they suggested the person?
They actually suggested that you find someone.
Oh, no.
And then they emailed that, okay, who can we find and how can we, and then they said there are people doing it, professional editors. And then they probably gave them some names and they contacted one person and then like it took him to publish 2 years. So a year it went through the process, and then they said, oh, now you need to make the language look native, and then they had to pay someone to
And
get
again,
it.
that's like, it's, again, I think that you have to be mindful. It can't be some sort of disengaged process.
Yeah.
But if it costs $3,000 and you don't have $3,000.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
like if everyone is agreed and there are prompts that you can put into ChatGPT or Copilot that it doesn't rewrite it for you. It literally gives you, like, it will pull out individual sentences and say, this sentence can be nativized
Yeah.
by changing this word and this word.
Mm.
Right? Like you don't, so you know exactly where you're getting the support from.
Yeah.
Right? So it's again, I don't think that's plagiarism. I don't think that's academic dishonesty. I don't think any of those things, right? It's, again, that's totally different than you saying, write this abstract for me,
Abstract for me, yeah.
right? I also think that you can use AI to help you write outlines.
Mm.
Right? Like I'm really interested in this area. Here are 5 research papers. Can you just outline what they talk about?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think all of those things can help native English speakers and not native English speakers through the process, right? I think that where I think people are having conversations about AI and what the boundary is and what the boundary isn't is faculty are concerned and they want to make sure that people know how to do science when they leave. It's like the calculator.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if people don't care if you use a calculator, but they care that you know how to do multiplication without a calculator. Right? They care that you know the steps to multiply 2 digits by 2 digits or 3 digits by 3 digits. But they don't, but once you learn the pattern, it doesn't matter if you use a calculator to multiply 752,000 by 832, right? Because if you needed to, you understood the pattern by doing it, right? I think the same way goes with writing. Like, if you understand the pattern of writing, asking software to help you along that process isn't necessarily dangerous to the integrity of the work.
And one more thing about Grammarly, I used it for my first dissertation, for my first PhD. So it was, so I was very proud that I have Grammarly now. I can have those language glitches and proofread things. And I ran everything and I clicked accept, and I went to my advisor. And I told her that I'm using Grammarly, and she was very fine. She said, no problems. And she started reading it. She said, Khalid, you don't write like this. I said, what happened? It was my first time using Grammarly, and it's so she said, the ideas are not connected. Grammarly only fixes the sentences. It does not fix the concept.
Yeah.
So then I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I went back and I unchecked some of the things that Grammarly said, you should change this, because it says change everything. Because it
Even
only said,
ChatGPT,
yeah.
ChatGPT, it also does the same,
Same
so
thing,
you have
yeah.
to like go
yeah,
through the way.
you have to be mindful
Yeah.
of what the concept is, what the idea is, and how you want to present it, and then go use those tools. And then my professor was saying, you just have to take, you don't write, you've been submitting stuff, and this is the first time I see this paragraph doesn't match with the next, and this sentence doesn't match. So it was like, oh, crappy. You have to understand how to use, and then I went back and I learned it, and I